Welcome everyone to Thursday, one of the last few days of January, as we get even closer to the release of the early access of Midnight. We also got some 12.0.1 Midnight beta development notes for balance tuning, for class and spec tuning in the beta. Now this will be a reasonably controversial one, since some of the choices in here are head-scratching at best. There are a couple of positive ones which are still kind of not that good. For example, when you read Preservation Evoker, temporal anomaly no longer shows on raid frames. It feels kind of bad knowing that nowadays this has to go in a list of patch notes. Something that up until just a few days ago it was a very simple option in whichever unit frame add-on you were using. Now it has to go through the Blizzard patch notes to manually remove the annoying icon of the temporal anomaly absorb shield on your frames. It has to be disabled manually by Blizzard. Same goes for Discipline Priest and getting Divine Ages to no longer show on raid frames. It also has to come off of a Blizzard set of patch notes. Now decent QOL, outright buff pretty much for Arcane Mage. Not that Arcane Mage needed any buffs, as we have seen from the performances of the specs a few days ago. Expanded Mind in team with its name has also been expanded. Now it doesn't just have your Arcane Blast or Arcane Surge give you 2 stacks of Arcane Salvo every cast, but also your Arcane Orb, which is reasonably minor considering the amount of times you will be casting Arcane Orbs compared to your other spells, and also how often you can generate those Salvo stacks. Where things get more controversial, for starters, is with Devastation. Now, the change initially is good, because you read Blizzard's description and it's like, okay, when you're playing Scale Commander, you're spending way too much time flying around with your deep breath. And when we say way too much time, we actually mean way too much time. This was thanks to 2 things. Number one, if you're playing Scale Commander, obviously you have Wing Leader, which gave you the cooldown reduction of Deep Breath, and on top of that you're playing with Strafing Run, which allows you the second cast, the recast of Deep Breath. So technically, every cast of Deep Breath, you were going to Deep Breath twice. And then you also had cooldown reduction. So, for example, in a 34-minute key, you had over 90 casts of Deep Breath, which were double casts, so you had like 46 casts of Deep Breath in 35 minutes. And you have to spend them flying around trying to strafe your movement past some Mythic Plus pack or something. So the idea initially of Blizzard is simple. We nerf the cooldown reduction of Wing Leader, so you don't have to spend nearly as much time inside of Deep Breath, but because, after all, that was still a good damage increase casting Deep Breath, we're going to compensate you with damage elsewhere. So Might of the Black Dragonflight increases black spell damage by 30%, and Refined Essence now increases Essence ability damage by 25% instead of 15%. Now this is somewhat though a half and half change, mostly because Might of the Black Dragonflight and your black spell damage is mostly for augmentation. Black spells, not really for devastation. Augmentation wasn't spending nearly as much time inside of Deep Breath because they don't have the Strafing Run talent. They don't get to double Deep Breath, even when they play Scale Commander. So for them the issue was much less problematic than Devastation, yet they are the ones who got this damage buff. Because Refined Essence isn't a straight buff for Devastation, it's a buff for the hero talent of Scale Commander, which is still available for augmentation. So, weirdly enough, despite Devastation being the most hurt spec of the downtime of you flying around in Deep Breath, the spec that actually gets buffed more from this change is augmentation instead. Now, ultimately, this is not extremely relevant for the simple fact that 99.99% of Devastation Evokers are already playing with Flame Shaper anyways. They weren't playing with Scale Commander to begin with. Also partially and partly because of the annoyance of this kind of mechanic, but definitely this change doesn't really make it any easier for you to go and play Scale Commander as a Devastation Evoker. Now the other head-scratching change for the day is Holy Paladin. This is a big one. Because, again, Blizzard tries to explain in the notes the logic for this, and the big logic is we are returning Crusader Strike as a baseline spell for Holy Paladins. If you see, for example, from this clip, this pre-change clip, you will see there is no Crusader Strike in my action bars or in my UI because it wasn't a button. It was only available once you enabled Avenging Crusader. Avenging Crusader would turn into Crusader Strike, and that's it. Now, what's the annoyance with this? Well, besides the main annoyance that this puts you back into being a melee spec, because before, without the strike to be in melee to actually use it, you could just stay in range. This one puts you again back as a melee spec. Number two, many of the changes in here are making space for Crusader Strike, but altering the rest of your buttons to make space for it. What this means is Judgment cooldown is increased by 83%, Holy Shock cooldown now is 9.5 seconds instead of 6 seconds, and then the rest of the cooldowns to make space for the strike, like Crusader Strike charges are back to being 2 instead of 1, Avenging Crusader no longer, turns into Crusader Strike, obviously, since now it's its own button, as well as the talent adjustments, of course. Shield of the Righteous now reduces the cooldown of Crusader Strike instead of Holy Shock, and Crusader's Might now causes Crusader Strike to reduce the cooldown of Holy Shock and Judgment. Now, if you look at the beta now, with these changes added in, the main issue is that before, your Judgment, obviously this is scaled with the haste on your gear, but your Judgment went from having like a 6-second cooldown to a 9-second cooldown. And then your Holy Shock also went from a 6 to a 9-second cooldown, hasted down to, in this case, 8. So you gained 5+ seconds worth of cooldowns on your 2 main buttons you used to press before. In exchange, you made space for this Crusader Strike. So technically, it's not that you gained more buttons to press. It's just that instead of pressing 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, you're now pressing 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And there is a badness in this. As we mentioned, number one, this forces you in melee, because with the Crusader Strike, you have to stay in melee, right? Number two, Crusader Strike is also terrible, because it does damage, it does no healing, it gives you 1 holy power, just like Judgment and just like Holy Shock, so it doesn't do anything extra. And the only time it becomes more useful than doing only a little amount of damage is exclusively if you're playing with Avenging Crusader, which is when Judgment and Crusader Strike heal up to 5 injured allies. Otherwise, it does nothing. So the only way you could go to being somewhat even remotely close to what you were before is if you did use your strike on cooldown, so you got the cooldown reduction from Crusader's Might, 1.5 seconds on your Holy Shock and your Judgment. So these cooldowns would go back to being somewhat like the pre-change duration of these 2 cooldowns. You can even see the actual, integration of Crusader Strike in your abilities, in your passives and talents. There is nothing. You have just the CDR from Crusader's Might and the extra healing when inside of Avenging Crusader. Nothing else really works with Crusader Strike. Nothing even in your hero talents. There is nothing in your Apex talents for the strike. Even in your tier set, it's all about Holy Shock as well. So they have added back this Crusader Strike, which isn't really doing anything much other than putting you back into melee as a Paladin and making your flow worse, because you were much better off just going with Judgment and with Holy Shock without really having to play around this Crusader Strike. So bad change for the flow of the playstyle of Holy Paladin, even though you could still complain about the state of Holy Paladin, the simpleness of the rotation after the changes in the beta. The addition of Crusader Strike back into your rotation wasn't really what you were looking for. Another change, this is a tiny one, is a nerf to Discipline. So we're not talking about the mechanics here, spells or buttons or anything, you just got Oracle nerfs. Piety redistributes less health and preventive measures gives you less damage to your abilities. That's just what it is. For Disc, one of the better performers right now in the beta as a healer. The other big change for the day after Paladin, after Evoker, the big change is to Restoration Shaman. Again, much like they said for Holy Paladin, they're also bringing back something for Resto Shaman. What they're bringing back is Tidal Waves. Tidal Waves was your passive which you gained by Riptide to give you faster cast time on your healing wave and on your chain heal. It was what was meant to give you this nice feeling of weaving in your Riptide and then your 2 casted spells, back with the instacast Riptide, back with 2 casted spells to make use of tidal waves. Now what was also added was something that initially sounds very cool, because Ascendance has been also redesigned. Now, Ascendance was already redesigned in the beta, even in the pre-patch. You got the change where, while Ascendant, casting Riptide causes your next healing wave or chain heal to be instant, and to also apply Riptide to your target, and giving you more healing. So you pop Ascendance, and all you do was basically insta-casting constantly, Riptide, healing wave, Riptide, healing wave, Riptide, healing wave, all instant, or Riptide chain heal constantly instant, which was already quite powerful. With this change though, instead your spells are no longer instant, but Chain Heal jumps to 3 additional allies with 10% healing reduced for all jumps, and Healing Wave will always crit and heal 1 additional ally at 50% effectiveness, so it's like double, it cleaves the healing, while also giving you a mana discount. Now, while this change still looks good, you lose the instacast portion of Ascendance, but you gain much more healing from the spells themselves. What hits way more is the fact that Whispering Waves has been removed. This was the added talent from like a season ago, which further pushed the Resto Shamans into this Riptide Healing Wave style of play. You spread as many Riptides as you can, and then you spam Healing Wave to splash all of that healing on all of your targets with Riptide. So suddenly now the value of your Ascendance doubling your healing waves, making them splash to an additional target, so ideally you could double splash that healing wave on all of your targets with Riptide because of Whispering Waves. It looked like huge value. Now it's gone completely, because the entire tool that made the build function, Whispering Waves, is gone now. So this is an attempt of Blizzard to make you go back to play more with Chain Heal, both with Tidal Wave buff coming back, making you cast faster with Chain Heal, and with Ascendance buffing your Chain Heal even more. This is partially due to, at the moment, basically Chain Heal being so weak that Resto Shamans in the beta were, again, essentially completely ignoring the actual button. So I guess it's an attempt to make Chain Heal still valuable, even though it is still missing all/most of the buffs, of the procs, of the talents you used to have that used to buff your Chain Heal, that are still gone right now for Resto Shaman. So these are the changes we have seen in this last round of tuning. That's why we said the controversial ones at the beginning, because the Evoker one is quite confusing, since it nerfs Scale Commander, which is more hurtful for Devastation, but then buffs Augmentation more. The change to Holy Paladin, bringing back Crusader Strike, but without really adding anything good, and if anything, nerfing your playstyle, since you will have fewer Holy Shocks and Judgments, and you will be again reliant on constantly being in melee range and constantly using your Crusader Strike to get at the very least cooldown reduction on Judgment and Holy Shock. And then Resto Shaman, nerfing, changing your instacast style of Ascendance to powering up more Chain Heal, giving you Tidal Wave back to also power up Chain Heal, but still lacking most of the support behind Chain Heal, which has been removed with the pruning. So none of these changes are particularly exciting for any of these 3 classes. Then of course there is still the general dooming. Every time you see a set of balance tuning, everyone that is left out wonders, where am I? Where are my changes? You know, where are the changes to the rogues, to Shadow Priest? How about the constantly bugged Mistweaver Monk? What are we going to do to Holy Priest? Why is nobody looking at Destro Warlock? These are things that will continue, of course, every time we have some balance tuning, especially one as, you know, tiny, as small as this one that we just got. On top of also not being very positive itself, since not many of the changes in here were that good. But for today though, on this Thursday, this is what we have seen in terms of the tuning changes. We will see, of course, as we will continue to have way more of these towards the release of the expansion and then the release of the actual first season of Midnight. But for today, on this Thursday, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I have to go out. I have to go out and shop for some groceries before it gets dark, which is like 5:30 p.m. nowadays, so I have to be quick.